So we're going to welcome Scott Perry. He's a recognized leader in digital governance and cyber assurances. He's the founder and CEO of the Digital Governance Institute, and he has a deep expertise in conformance programs, decentralized identity, and cybersecurity standards. So he is a co-chair here at Trust Over IP's Foundation's steering committee. And of course, we all know him from his participation and leadership in other working groups as well. And he is continuing to shape the future of trusted digital ecosystems. Scott.
All right, so let me share my screen, okay, now I think I can. And we can get started. So based on the participants, I will focus my energy around educating you on what this C2PA is. All right, now I hope everyone can see the screen. And focus also on the application of the governance metamodel, a governance process that we've developed at the Trust Over IP, and how it's been applied for a global standard. So excited to have the opportunity. This is a preview, actually, because the program will be officially launched on June 4th. And so you'll get an opportunity to see some things that organizations won't get a chance to see until the 4th, when we launch in New York City at the Content Authenticity Initiative Symposium. So also gives me an opportunity to make an announcement, and I'll talk a little bit more about the group that I'm now the co-chair of. So this week, I have been elected the co-chair of the Creator Assertions Working Group, and that's out of the Decentralized Identity Foundation DIF. So I'll talk a little bit more about that and what it does in relationship to the C2PA, because they are aligned with the C2PA. And so a lot, all of the folks in this call know me. But those that are listening to this or watching the video on this may want to have a better understanding of where I come from, is focusing on governance and trust. I have been an advisor with the U.S. federal government for a long time on traditional X509 certificate governance. I was an auditor in that space for many years, recognized in the space, and also we always like to put the Self-Sovereign Identity book, which I put a chapter in on governance, and the topic we're going to talk about today. So let's first talk about what the C2PA is. And I think there was another C2P, there was another CCPA. I think that is a standard from California, so they had to change the name and make it C2PA, which is the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. That's a big handful. So in essence, it's easier to say C2PA, it rolls off the tongue pretty easily. But basically, it's all of the major tech companies, except Apple, we're going to get Apple soon, coming together to create a standard for provenance, authenticity, truth signals on digital objects that can be digitally attached to digital objects. I'll talk a little bit more about how that gets applied. And obviously the topic of our discussion here is how we govern that. And so you can see the list of members. We have major tech platforms. We also have major product manufacturers. And so the C2PA specification is focused on product and the use of the specification in products. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is too. So there's a lot of play around the content credential specification, which has been created by the C2PA and we'll talk about how it's used to bind let's say a ledger of truth signals, trust signals against a digital object that's bound to it and linked to it. And so it has gained a lot of media attention. The organization, the C2PA, has the backing of a marketing arm called the Content Authenticity Initiative, which is a marketing arm sponsored by Adobe, which has, I believe, up to 3,000 or probably more. If someone else was here to correct me, they would, members. So they have a very large marketing organization that's getting the word out that this is the standard to use. Matter of fact, there's a bill in New York State that actually has the C2PA specification in the document. So, and it also received an endorsement by the NSA and other countries as use. And we'll talk a little bit about how it can be used for higher levels of assurance. And there is a level of assurance associated with it. And so the C2PA is out in the marketplace working. It's working with the Embassy of France. You know, it is getting global recognition. And I believe after this conformance program is launched, it will also continue to take off. So what is a content credential? And that is the manifest that's attached to a digital object. And you can see here the digital object in play here is not real, unless somebody knows about a cat that's got you know, a tail and fins. But what it's proposed to do is to create a ledger of actions against a digital object that is bound to it. Okay, camera took picture, edited picture, and or an AI took this picture, and that fact has been represented digitally on this manifest. Okay, so we'll get into a little bit more details around that, but that's the purpose. It's kind of the nutrition label on food. That's how they've been purporting that. It's really the nutrition label of all digital objects. So you have better information regarding the source of a digital object, not just so that you know some of the trust signals that have been communicated with it. And so how it works is there are manufacturers, product manufacturers, that are building the specifications in the, you know, in their product to generate these manifests every time an action is taken with their product, like taking a picture. So in this case, the picture is taken, and when the picture is taken, in this case, TruePic is one of the members of the C2PA, has incorporated the specification in and has added that manifest in at the time the picture was taken. Now, it's more than just that, because it's not just the picture, but it's all of the actions taken with that picture. So obviously there was the origination picture, you know, taken in, you know, some very cold place, and then it was edited and applied, and all of those actions are records that are added to the manifest in a cryptographically binding format. So you have the whole full history of how things went in, including also if you're pulling in ingredients and making, you know, a new document, all of the ingredients are identified as well. That's a lot of work that's going into the specification to identify that trail. All right, you can see again, and let's see if I can get out of this and then go on to the next slide. So you can see that. And okay, so in essence, the manifest is really the foundation, the platform that claims can be made against a digital object. And there will be lots of different claims made by various industries and various identifiers and various individuals that want to make it. But let's be clear, the C2PA takes responsibility really for two major actions on this foundational document. They focus on what's on the left bottom, the created assertions, which are product driven. Camera took picture, Photoshop edited picture. And so they're actions taken within a product to make assertions about that particular digital asset. Okay, there are many other actions that are desired to go against. Scott Perry, took the picture, or we're using a industry identifier that we want to apply to this picture. Those aspects are not the responsibility of the C2PA. C2PA did not want to get involved in all of the potential actions and variances about those types of things. They wanted to create the platform. They create the platform and they create the binding between the digital asset and the manifest using X509 certificates. Now at the IIW, where I first launched that, there was, this went up in arms. Oh, we're using certification authorities on that. And at the end of the day, it works. And it works very well for products. If we deal with, identity assertions, that is going to be the purview, as I had mentioned, where I've become the co-chair of the Creator Assertions Working Group, which is working out of DIF. And that deals with gathered assertions, ones that are not taken by the product, but those that individuals or organizations outside of product want to make on the digital object and apply them. And so the standards associated with that are not the responsibility of the C2PA. They're looking at other groups like COG to create standards in doing that. And COG has been very active in working on identity assertions and metadata assertions, and now started a task force to work with certain industries like media industries. Matter of fact, Eric Scouten and I met with the Screen Actors Guild union around their application and education on their responsibility to create their own ecosystem around their own identifiers and their applications of these.
Scott, we have a
Yes.
question from Eric. Is it okay to take questions during the talk, or would you like them at the end?
Absolutely. I think this is, like I said, friends and family here, we're absolutely open for that. Hopefully, I'll just be able to get through all of my material. But Eric, what do you have?
The X509 certificate is attached to who or what?
Yeah, so it's attached, and I'll explain how that is. But when a picture is taken, the X509 certificate will be binding it, will be used to bind the product to the asset. So camera manufacturers will be needing to get those certificates from approved certification authorities to apply. So when you take a picture, it will do the binding. It will do the signing on behalf of the product.
Right. So each individual product camera has its own certificate, or is it sort of
Yes.
really?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. They'll, that's the structure that's needed to be created more, as we move towards, device, IoT device certificates are very prevalent. It's moving towards that type of IoT device specification. And we'll talk about that. So this is a very familiar slide to members of the Trust Over IP project. This is the trust triangle, right? And what I will be doing in this presentation is talking about what we've established as standards within our organization and how it is being applied at the C2PA. So in the C2PA, instead of the holder, which used to be on the top, basically the target of the governance process is the digital asset. And the digital asset is anything that really can be, represented in ones and zeros, PDFs or pictures or even representations of AI, music. I mean, it goes to a wide variety of applications. That's why, its acceptance and importance is paramount, to a wide scale trust in the marketplace. And so similar to, you know, this indirect trust that we had within trust over IP, the product, as you can see, going back to Eric's question, the certification authority will be issuing X509 certificates to generator products. And those products will be applying and generating and signing those created assertions to the digital asset. And it doesn't matter, you know, that there is any kind of relationship between the validator, as they call it, or the verifier and the generator. As long as they're meeting the requirements of the C2PA, you'll get validation that there hasn't been any tampering. So we're dealing with tamper evidency, and it will like detect whether there has been any tampering after the digital signing has been taking place. And so that's very, very key in that, as well as it will be under the spec. And so really the essence of the C2PA ecosystem have three major roles, because we talk about this in the governance, is the roles of the CA, which will be issuing certificates only to generator products that appear on the conforming products list. And we'll have a trust list that is being established and launched, which identifies those products that are getting signing certificates, such as the camera or the TruePic, as we've seen, and they are authorized to only deliver those signing certificates to those products on the list, as well as the generator products can only get certificates from those CAs on the CA trust list.
Scott,
And so, yes.
I was wondering if I could ask a question.
Sure.
This is back a little bit, you were talking about the digital asset. So you'll have the digital asset, and then adjacent to it, you're going to have this created assertions metadata, correct?
Right. Adjacent, attached, it could be in the cloud. You know, there's a variety of ways that you attach it, but there is a binding between the manifest and the digital asset. Yes.
Right. And because I mean, working with research data, I'm familiar with other things that one would want to also bind to the digital asset, such as the license for usage, et cetera. But I'm assuming, because I'm just wondering if the binding to the asset could be expanded to accept other pieces of metadata as well as this assertions document. That's number one. Because that would be a more general usage. And then the other question is, has C2PA looked at W3C has a standard called PROV for provenance. It's an ontology for marking up provenance metadata with a model. And maybe that could be incorporated, if it isn't already, into the created assertion, so that the words that are used in creative assertions can be mapped to this bigger understanding.
Right. So a couple of questions, a couple of things. So the metadata, which is outside a product, needs to be developed outside of the C2PA. And so the COG could identify those. But the essence really is very focused around, you know, ledger of actions. There's this in the C2PA parlance, there's a CAN set of actions that are built into the specification. I took the picture, I edited the picture. In the COG will also have a set of actions based on identity and metadata and endorsement and allowing machine learning, to be used. And so they're basically, the focus is around a ledger of actions. And so to answer your second question is, the C2PA is very active in working with the W3C. Matter of fact, in one of our just meetings this week, Leonard Rosenthal, who is the head of the technical working group of the C2PA, gave us a briefing of his latest meeting with the W3C. So very well established in those discussions. All right, so let's go over, the concepts of the conformance program. So we talked in Trust over IP about holding accountable. So we're creating a program which will hold generator and validator products accountable to the specification that's already been published, okay? And we will hold certification authorities to, there are certain items in the specification, but we have created a certificate policy, which is very familiar to CAs. They act and operate under certificate policies. We've created one for that, and they will be held accountable to meeting the policy requirements. The C2PA is planning on putting 4 levels of assurance around the implementation of products associated with that. I'm going to go into it in a little more detail. We're rolling out 2 levels. And believe me, the creation of levels of assurance is not a minor task. It took a lot of effort and is still ongoing and finalizing to make that happen. And so the C2PA, the reason why we need to get something out sooner is there is a requirement in the spec that we have trust lists established. And so we will see trust, I'm not allowed to say registries in C2PA, meaning that has a very ISO definition associated with it, but for our governance discussion, they are in effect trust registries. And we are implementing, that's also a big effort because we're dealing with a lot of high-powered companies that want specifications and legal agreements all reviewed and such. So we have legal agreements ready to be finalized. So we are planning 2 releases in the near term. The first one is ready to roll, and we'll be announcing that in a couple of weeks, in June 4th in New York City. And eventually, hopefully before the end of the year, we will be coming out with another release. And so in the first release that's coming out, we have legal agreements ready to go. We will have the 2 trust lists that I've mentioned. We are creating 2 levels of implementation assurance, and we are using a self-assertion confidence model. We don't have the mechanisms in place to hold organizations accountable for meeting the specification. We don't have an assurance mechanism in place yet to do that. So just to get launched, we are requiring participants to self-assert that they are meeting the specification and the other requirements that we are making forward. So finally, where really the true initial rollout will be having the legal agreements and the trust lists. We will be adding 2 other levels of implementation assurance. And the higher ones, I'm sure, are of interest to high assurance organizations like the NSA and such. And so I think that would be interesting to get into. It's been interesting just to get 2 levels of assurance. And we are looking at independent attested conformance that products are actually meeting the requirements of the spec. Eric, you had a question? You're on mute.
Yeah. Do you, can you talk a little bit more about the implementation assurance, those levels?
Yes. Yeah, I'll go into that as part of this rest of this presentation. Absolutely.
Yep.
All right, so let's go through the governance metamodel process for the trust over IP and see how it has been applied by the C2PA governance framework and conformance program. So our governance metamodel process within trust over IP starts with a risk assessment. And so we have documentation that's available for use, and we used it, okay? And the C2PA has a task force called the Threats and Harms Task Force that have already created a number of different threats for implementers of the spec. And so they've identified the following as major issues, which really are the driving factors for the spec and the implementation, as we talked about levels of assurance and implementation. And later in the presentation, I'll show how the security implementation objectives have been applied against these particular threats, which also manifest into requirements that implementers have to demonstrate in order to be part of the conformance program. So these are major issues around, the tampering of evidence and tampering of the manifest as it relates to creating the trust signals that the marketplace wants to see happen. So the next step after creating the risk assessment is creating a set of governance requirements and a framework to use and mitigate risk, not eliminate it, but mitigate risk. So how that's done in the trust over IP metamodel is the set of primary documents and control documents, which is very familiar to people in this call, but this is how we've applied it. And actually we've applied it in a very, very consistent way. I'm very proud that it worked very, very well. And I've really identified the need for the glossary. We've been working on the glossary in the last month, and it has been turning out to be something that's very valuable to communicate new terms to the marketplace. Matter of fact, we're just creating terms that we can all agree to, such as calling it a generator product. It used to be a claim generator. And so working through terms for a new organization and ecosystem is pretty critical, because we better have the agreement within ourselves before we roll it out for use. And so most of the stuff for the most part is very consistent. Here's where we have, in addition to the C2PA specification requirements, we also have the implementation security requirements, which I'll go over. We have the legal agreements, and we have the threats and harms created additional privacy, inclusion, equitability requirements. Okay, so now that we have defined the requirements within the program, how are we going to run it? Now, we haven't run it yet, but this is the plan to do so. So we needed to identify all the roles associated with the interim role and the initial rollout. And so we have governing authority. Matter of fact, we have not only a governing authority, which is the C2PA steering committee, we have an administering party, which is the Conformance Task Force, which runs under the technical working group of the C2PA. And we've been tasked to administer the conformance program. And so governed parties would be the CAs, the generator product companies, and the validator product companies that want to hold themselves accountable to the requirements of the program. And so we are setting up legal agreements between the C2PA and those governed parties to set the roles and responsibilities of each parties, and they will have to be signed in order for them to participate in the program.
Scott, we have a question from Diane.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, hi, Scott. The extent to which this relates to ownership of content was not immediately clear to me in that. So would it, for example, be on each ecosystem to determine how they would want to, I don't know, for example, chain a content credential to, let's say, a personal ID or so on? Or is that something that the C2PA wants to get into or determine how this helps with, say, ownership of content itself?
Right. That's a great question. Thank you for reminding me. There are certain aspects that the C2PA wants to get involved in and certain things that they don't, because, ownership is driven by a variety of jurisdictional laws and copyright laws around the world. The C2PA specification is used to contribute to that, but not to define copyright issues and define ownership. It is the hope that copyright laws can use the trust signals that are coming from the C2PA specification and conformance program in use for defining ownership and copyright. So I would also, since this is driven initially, there's a large percentage of folks focusing on PDF. There is an organization called JPEG Trust, which is also creating an ISO standard in concert with the C2PA standard, which is becoming an ISO standard this year. And JPEG Trust is focusing on copyrights. And so look at copyrights as a part of the ownership, but it is used, and it would be directed to look otherwise around ownership using the trust signals that the C2PA manifest would create. And is that, we're good? Okay.
It does. Thank you.
All right. Let's see where we're at. So legal agreements, we had that in the governance meta model. And so what is really in a legal agreements on conformance programs? So we have the these are the players, and we identify the responsibilities of their of an applicant, and they have to be they have to have, the CAs have to have conformance to the certificate policy, and the generator products and the validator products assert conformance to the spec, as well as the generator product has to assert, and not only assert, but we'll talk about a little bit more around how they are implementing it and can meet those implementation requirements. And the C2PA takes responsibility for maintaining the specification, the program, and the trust lists. The key thing also is what happens when circumstances come out in the marketplace which drive the need to remove a product company from the trust list. And we've been very sensitive around that, and I've learned a lot about how we need to be very open, transparent, as well as fair in the process of that. And so we've created mediation and dispute resolution mechanisms, and we put those in terms in the legal agreements, so that all parties have a recourse when there are challenges to decisions made in the process. So there's also change management around product changes and things. We are setting ourselves up to elicit fees within the conformance program, so it can be self-generating, but that's not what we are rolling out the interim program with. And obviously, when we, through the program, we will be, asking for certain evidence to demonstrate conformance. There needs to be some confidentiality terms associated with it. All right. So now we get into the meat of actually what is the trust assurance or the conformance criteria. We've created documents within the trust over IP, to give guidance around how that is. In parlance to, how it works within the C2PA, is that the conformance criteria, which is really the spec and the security implementation requirements, is the conformance criteria that we are rolling out for the interim. And in essence, we will be talking, and I'll talk about how that infrastructure assessment, there will be an independent assessment on the infrastructure, on the implementation of the product and its infrastructure. And so governed parties have to communicate how they are meeting those requirements as well. And at the end of the day, the administrating party, which is the conformance task force, will be adding records to the trust list based on this process, even as we roll it out in the interim basis. But eventually, we're going to have more independent assessment, and we will have, we have to talk about this. It's a very dense specification. There's over 300 requirements for the generator products, 350 requirements for the validator product, so, in order for an auditor to go through all of that, and a lot of them are code-based, we're looking at alternatives to have quality control software or process to be used against a product to determine if it is meeting the requirements. So we haven't finalized those things, but there are models in the marketplace that we're looking at on how to do that. But that's something that will probably take the rest of the year to finalize. All right, so this goes back to Eric's question around here. Remember, here were the threats. Okay, so the conformance criteria is the spec, and the spec is now at level 2.2. The program will be is being based on 2.1 and later, which has added a number of different requirements. So it may take some time for products to be compliant with it. But we are looking at levels of assurance around the implementation of a product. Now, it's not just the product, but it's also its infrastructure, whether it's in a cloud environment that provides certain infrastructure components associated with it. And so the product and its supporting infrastructure is called the target of evaluation. And that target of evaluation will need to be assessed against the different levels of assurance, level 1 and level 2, which are requirements coming out of these security objectives. So each security objective will have different requirements under different levels of assurance. And if you want to meet a certain level of assurance, you have to meet that level completely in order to get your certificate. And you'll get a certificate that is applied with an OID, an object identifier, that says you're allowed to issue this certificate and denote it as level 2. And your max assurance can be level 2. So you can get a level 1, you can get a level 1 certificate, but you could also get a level 2, right? So each certificate that you get will be tied to an identifier that will be tied to a level of assurance. So in the marketplace, that is the identifier. When you get, you look at your manifest and you can look at the OID in the certificate to see, it was issued at a certain assurance level, and that would be the identifier of that. Eric?
Scott, can you give maybe just 2 examples of what are 2 sample implementations? Because,
okay.
Yeah.
So, I think the easiest one that I can do is to take a picture. So TruePic is, founding member of the C2PA. They built software within cameras, that when I take a picture, it generates a manifest attached to the picture. Okay. So that would be, so the software that's used to generate the picture and the manifest is a product.
That's an example of an implementation. And
in the implementation on a phone is an implementation. So they have identified 3 classes of implementation. One is on an edge device. One is on a back-end cloud device. So in most cases, Photoshop would be your other example, because I can make edits to a digital object, and each edit that I make will create a record on the manifest. And so the Photoshop will be a product on the conforming products list. Okay. And that most of the time operates in the cloud. Now, we have talked about kind of a hybrid, what we call a distributed class, where certain actions are taken on the phone, but they communicate with a cloud device that, may actually, issue the certificate or sign the digital object. So there is kind of this hybrid, and we've had to spend some time thinking about how the communication between the edge device and the back-end cloud system is, and what security implementations you want to have secured communication between the two, right? And so, matter of fact, there was an article that that trust over IP came out around using this trust spanning protocol, which is a very novel idea. That could be a use to apply one of the solutions around the security objective around the communication between the components. Okay, and so that is probably going to be a lot of the initial work, is evaluating infrastructures to meet the security implementation requirements. So the process really for conformance, which we are ready to roll out by hook or by crook, is we have an intake form that we've created, which collects basic information. Now, if an organization wants to be rated at a max assurance level of 2, they will need to be able to come back. They have to come back with additional evidence and architecture documents to show how they're meeting those implementation requirements. So we'll review the application and we'll, evaluate their implementation around that before, and we would require that legal agreement to be signed, and we'll do that assessment of the infrastructure, and hopefully if that meets the requirements, we'll add a record to the conforming products list, as well as we'll add a record to the CA trust list if that's what they are conforming to. Okay, so going back to our trust over IP process, we're still going to learn this residual risk assessment. We'll see, when organizations come in and they are requiring, conformance, they're providing evidence. We're going to learn from this, and we'll adapt. And the adaption process, and maybe they won't meet the requirements.Maybe the requirements were too restrictive or didn't meet those things. We'll do a residual risk assessment and add it to the risk assessment, so we can update the program and continually do improvement, self-improvement to the process. And that's part of the trust over IP process, is to really identify what are the risks. Are organizations not meeting the requirements, so will not get on the trust list. And the trust list is really the identifier that that governed parties have met the requirements, as we have talked about it. So at the final step, we are including registries, a list of approved governed parties of this particular scheme. And so trust lists, we have 2, it's actually in essence 3. We are adding a timestamp authority. It'll be interesting because timestamps will probably be used in this ecosystem more than it's ever been used in the history of that technology, because folks, they want to know, do you have trust at the time that the picture was taken? And so that's commonly used for code signing. And you want to know that at a particular release level, this is the assurance you can provide, because digital objects last forever. So you want to have that trust signal of at time of claim assertion, and you need that certified time element attached to it. And so these are the kinds of records that that are in the schema for the trust list. All right, so I think I've gone through the majority, of the program. Eric, you have, now I'm ready to take more questions, and Eric is with his hand up, so.
Great. Thank you, Scott. So since this is the Ecosystem and Governance Working Group, can you talk a little bit about the impetus for governance to be applied now to a program and a technology that has existed and sort of been maturing for a couple of years? And when's the right time to really go strong on governance? Because it seems that if you start with governance, then you won't get too far, because you need the tech and you need the use case to exist for you to determine the governance. But you can't go very far if you don't at some point say we need to really solidify the governance, or else we're not going to be able to scale. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That's a great question. And I think it's important to kind of talk about the history, because we're going to be dealing with this with lots of governing authorities that have to deal with it. So I first, started talking to the C2PA over a year ago. And the first reaction to members of the C2PA is, we don't need any advisement on governance. We're gonna work it all out. We'll be fine. They had created a conformance program. They knew they needed it, because the key aspect is you have a spec out, but you can't control the use of the specification. you had maybe trust lists, but you couldn't govern how, who was applying and who was using it and who was approved to use it. They couldn't get, their arms around, on controlling the specification use. And so they realized clearly that the governance program was needed to operationalize the spec. The spec had a limitation in its usefulness without a governance program around it, as well as creating these levels of assurance, because there are so many different applications of this foundational, manifest binding type of thing, industry and degree of assurance associated with it, that you needed to create kind of a multi-dimensional aspect to it. And so, when I first started with the meetings, there are amazingly smart people I've been privileged to work with for the last year, but they didn't have a structure. And I came in with my toolkit from the Trust over IP project, and it worked beautifully. It just created the structure to allow them to make the right decisions for themselves. And our Trust over IP model works. And it creates a structure to allow what an organization and a governing authority wants to hold people accountable for in their own purposes, but not dictate necessarily all the specifics. It creates the framework, the architecture, the foundation, and it has worked beautifully. And I'm very pleased with the work that we've done. It all has benefited them, and they realized, first of all, we got off the schneid, because a lot of times we were spending a lot of time talking about structure. Well, boom, structure's done. We have the structure. Now let's talk about what we want to hold people accountable, and talk about the individual, for example, the implementation security requirements, which are hard topics, but not structural topics to deal with. Neil, you had a question?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, they made a deliberate choice to leave the human factor out of the C2PA. So I guess the question is, now that you're familiar with this, how would you see governance applying differently to the work coming out of COG in terms of how it integrates with the C2PA for a more complete picture?
Yeah, so my view of the COG is actually the ecosystem for the COG is I think dimensionally larger. Anybody on the planet, if we're dealing with identity assertions, we're dealing with millions of people. If we're dealing with identifiers, there are millions of different identifiers in industries and such. So it really, I think, the tiered structure of trust signals and assurance around digital objects, I believe, will come from three avenues. One is the products that are applying the manifest. Then you have the structure of the identity, metadata, endorsement, and the AI learning process specifications that are containers that then industries will then need to create their own applications within those established containers. So there are a wide variety of different containers that can be used and applied within COG. COG is I think, going to be a very interesting ride. And I would encourage, since it's in our sister organization, and Neil, I know you're a member of DIF, I encourage you to get more involved in that. I think there's going to be a tremendous amount of work and value application in that space. But the C2PA is needed really to create that foundational element.
Okay.
All right. Well, it's great. I think I fit right up to the hour, and thank you for the opportunity to have me speak to this group, the friends and family group. Excited to share some of the things that I've been working on for the last year, and demonstrate to all of you, I hope, how the work that we've put in within Trust over IP is applied to a real world scenario, which is creating, needed trust in a marketplace that is now becoming blurry with trust. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Scott. That was fantastic.